In this mini episode of the Writer's Gym podcast, we're going to be sharing random writing tips from each of us. Welcome to the Writer's Gym. The Writer's Gym podcast. Build creative confidence and grow your writing life with Rachel Knightley and Emily Incan. Here at the Writer's Gym, we're getting ready to record another batch of episodes, which we'll be sharing through June and early July, ahead of a summer break before we return again in the autumn. In this short episode, we're going to share a few handy writing tips from each of us. You may wish to try some or all of these, and if you do, please let us know by contacting us on social media or by email how you got on. Similarly, if you have any topics you'd like us to discuss in future episodes, please feel free to let us know and we'll add them to our plans. We'll print details of how you can get in touch and find out more about us in the show notes of this podcast. We're going to start this edition by hearing from Rachel Knightley, beginning with the most important writing tip she's ever heard.
The most important writing advice is never about writing. Knowing that is the most important writing advice I've ever experienced, the most important writing tip that I've ever experienced. Knowing that most of what happens before we're anywhere near a blank page means that you realise there's a lot you can allow yourself to do. There's a lot that you can liberate. And that for me is the most important thing of all. I was having a conversation this morning with somebody who can always tell you every single thing that can go wrong in every given situation. And she insisted today, I'm not a creative person and I am never going to be creative. And I said, if that's ever a conversation that you want to have, please do. And I didn't open that conversation because one thing I have learned is that you can only really have those conversations when you're ready to. But that acceptance that there are creative people and there are not creative people. A lot of what the school system has done over my life and quite a lot of the lives before me has resulted in it being completely understandable that people think like that. But if you can imagine all of the things that can go wrong in a situation, if your anxiety and your awareness of what could but hasn't yet gone wrong is there, then your creativity is there. Creativity and anxiety are operating on exactly the same software. I would say the one thing that moves you over from one to the other is the ability to be curious. Now, it takes a lot of focus. It takes a lot of self-esteem to go, actually, I can move out of crisis mode and think about what I want to create. Now, that is no small thing, but it brings me to the second tip. That is the one that I would give myself in any situation. Aim to be interested, not interesting. When we're trying to be interesting, that is when we're sort of outside of our center of gravity. We're trying to please people, whether they actually exist or not, and try to get them interested in this thing we're doing before we know what it is yet. And that's why vomit drafting is such a useful thing, because it's about going, what have I got in my head? Let's have a look at it. And then what interests me about this? What can I take further? And the more you do that, the more you do find what you want to do. Another one, and this is another of the first draft commandments in your creative writing toolkit, is there is no wrong answer. Because when I talk about commandments, they're not really commands. It's probably a Jewish thing. Our central prayer isn't actually a prayer. It's just a reminder. It's a note to self. So when I say commandments, I don't mean I'm telling you what to do. I mean, I'm reminding you of things I hope will help you. And here's another one of my favorites. There is no wrong answer. This is especially true when you're writing from a prompt, but actually it's true all the time. Writing your first draft as freely as you can without worrying about whether you're doing it right is vital to the story that you will find, that you have it in you to tell, and more importantly, to the voice in which you will tell it, because it's that voice that keeps evolving. And that's why when people say, what if my idea isn't original enough? The answer is, got good news and bad news. It isn't. There's a lot of ideas going around that have been ideas before, but never through you. There may be 7 basic plots, that's another one, but there are infinite original voices. Pick the writing tips and pick the writing advice that get you in touch with yours and get you enjoying and exploring what you want to say.
Thank you to Rachel for those tips. Now, next up in this Writing Tips edition is me, Chris Gregory, with some thoughts on writing for audio drama and how audio drama can help your general writing. These tips were originally shared on the Write On Audio podcast from Pen to Print, which is another fantastic podcast aimed at writers. We'll share a link in our show notes. These writing tips are all about writing for audio drama. Now, before you shout, "But I don't want to write audio drama," at your speaker or headphones, just pause for a moment. The bedrock of writing for audio drama is dialogue. So if you can tell stories almost entirely through dialogue, as you'll need to if you're writing audio drama, your dialogue in your novels and short stories should improve also. Writing for radio or podcasts is great practice for writing sharper and more realistic dialogue across your creative practice. Also, for those of you who are budding playwrights or screenwriters, audio drama could be a perfect stepping stone towards achieving your wider ambitions. It could be a means of getting something you've written professionally produced, with you as the writer part of a production team involving actors, sound designers and a director, but at a tiny fraction of the cost of making a film or putting on a play at your local theatre. Of course, I would argue that writing and producing radio drama is a perfectly fine ambition in and of itself. You can do things in audio drama that you'll struggle to do in other mediums, and your work will be available to a global audience if you release it as a podcast. So let's think about dialogue and what it needs to do in a radio drama. Well, firstly, it will need to tell the majority of your story. No pressure. You don't have the luxury of long, flowery descriptions of the view across the valley or long panning shots across the desert that will win your cinematographer an Oscar. You do, however, have access to the best visual effects generation software ever invented. I mean, of course, the imaginations of your listeners. A few well-chosen words spoken by your characters and a nicely immersive soundscape will set imaginations firing and transport your audience to the place you're describing. Your audience want to be swept away. They wouldn't be listening otherwise. So give them those cues and they'll work with you. One of the traps that new audio drama writers often fall into is that of trying to be overly descriptive with their dialogue and thus producing unnatural sounding speech and unconvincing characters. No one steps out of their front door and announces to the world, "I'm going to the supermarket now." But many new writers produce dialogue like this when they first try to write radio drama. One trick to get around unnatural dialogue, but still keep listeners in the loop, is to introduce a second character whose role is to ask questions. This allows dialogue to sound chatty and more real. "Where are you going, Jane?" "Oh, I'm going to Tesco. I need to buy a bottle of wine." "You know who is coming round tonight." And this serves the purpose of not only explaining where Jane is going, but why. It raises expectations as to what might be happening next and who you know who might be. You can also use these questioning characters to establish other information, some of which might not otherwise be established in dialogue. "Oh, you know who, eh? How are you feeling about him now?" Which would allow Jane to express thoughts, fears, anxieties and aspirations for this relationship, and for us to learn something about you know who without having met them. And here's another thing about well-written dialogue. It can impart quite a bit of useful information in a very few words. This helps us to get into a story quickly and give us as much information about our main characters as possible so that listeners establish a connection quickly. You'll know as a short story or novel writer that it's important to get into your story quickly to grab your reader's attention as soon as you can. This is even more crucial for radio drama writers. There are daunting statistics about the percentage of listeners that switch off within a minute or so of the play starting. And as podcasters, we can see even more information about audience retention. So use your first minute to achieve as much of the following as possible. First, intrigue your audience. Make them feel that they'll be missing out on something if they switch off now. Fear of missing out, or FOMO, as I believe young people call it, is a powerful tool, so use it if you can, and especially at the start of your story. Have your characters establish something about their personalities early on. Make them intriguing, nasty, engaging or interesting, if you can, whilst trying to avoid creating lazy stereotypes or caricatures. Help your listeners to establish who your characters are. In radio drama, we don't have the visual clues that viewers of TV or theatre productions do to connect the deep husky voice with the tall guy in the hat called Dave. If Dave's height is going to be important to your story, have someone say, "Mind your head, Dave." But most critically, help your audience to associate this voice with the name Dave by dropping in that name a little more than you might in other writing. "Good morning, Dave. Have you got that report for me?" And then, "But Dave, I specifically asked for it to be on my desk by 9 a.m. What we're doing here is just trying to help the listeners associate the voice they're about to hear with the character name Dave. Start with a bang. Not necessarily an explosion or a gunshot, unless you really fancy it, but perhaps a conflict, a revelation, something that shocks or frightens your main character. A challenge or a mystery that will vex your characters through the story might fall into this category, as well as introducing the mystery or intrigue we spoke about earlier. If your play is a comedy, try to drop a strong joke into the story early on to get your audience chuckling. For horror or thrillers, offer something to demonstrate the danger or threat your characters are facing early in the story if you can. Some things to avoid in the early part of your story might include unnecessary or slow dialogue that doesn't really move your story forward. If you do feel the need to provide peripheral or background information about your characters or situations, do so once you have hooked your readers. You need to earn the right to wander a bit from pure plot and story development, especially in a short drama. Breaking the fourth wall, where a character speaks directly to the audience, can be a powerful tool in your box of tricks as a writer of dialogue. It allows you to explore the inner thoughts of a character and have them share secrets or confessions with your listeners. It can break up the flow of your drama, moving from conversation to reflection and making the audience feel a particular connection to one of your characters. Don't overdo this, and establish a few rules for how you'll use it before you start. Which character or characters are allowed to do it, and why. If this is something you're going to rely on later in a script, make sure you do it earlier in your story. It will feel like a very strange surprise if a character starts speaking to the audience an hour into your drama, having not done so earlier. Use your ears. Listen out for natural dialogue. Listen to how speech works. Next time you're in a coffee shop or a pub, just listen to conversations going on around you. People don't finish sentences, they talk across each other. They raise and lower their voices for emphasis. They mumble and stumble over words. Think about which of these features and foibles you can incorporate into your dialogue, but always bear in mind that you must maintain clarity. In a medium in which dialogue and the speech of your characters is your primary and often your only means of telling a story, the voices you use and those that you give to your characters must be clear and understandable at all times. Remember, in TV and film, We have the benefit of being able to lip read along as characters speak. Some directors can get away with having characters speak very softly or mumble, but that's going to lose your audience in a radio play. Here's another trick for improving the quality of your dialogue for audio drama. Listen to the dialogue on TV or films with your eyes closed. Think about whether this dialogue would work for an audience without the benefit of visuals. If not, what would you need to do to change it? Could you do this without inserting long narrative passages or putting unnatural dialogue into the mouths of your characters? So, a few final points about dialogue in radio drama. Analyse your dialogue by reading it aloud. It's not enough just to read it on the page when you're writing for sound. Have a friend help you read some of the characters so you can get a feel for how the dialogue flows and hangs together when performed. Use accents and dialects to give your story colour and authenticity, but don't sacrifice clarity. Break the fourth wall by having a character speak directly to the audience to give an additional power of expression to your characters, but use this sparingly and establish some rules that your audience will understand about how you're going to use it. Drop in the occasional monologue, but be clear why you're doing this, and be careful that monologues don't outstay their welcome or exceed their usefulness to your storytelling. Thank you for listening to my writing tips, and I do hope you're inspired to have a go at writing for audio drama. And finally, here's Emily Inkpen with some fantastic writing advice for scripts and prose, and hopefully an uplifting end to this short edition.
I'm going to start with a tip for script writers, a golden rule. The script is for everyone except the listener. Primarily, it is a tool or a map for everyone involved in making the thing. That's the actors, director, producer, sound designer. Think about what those people need. And they mainly need sound prompts. And these are best kept to descriptive passages between lines. Mood and delivery prompts are for the actors, and it's best to keep these in line with the dialogue so the actors can tell at a glance that they apply to their performance specifically. If you bury those directions, like actor-specific directions, amongst the sound descriptions and prompts in a passage, the actor then has to dig through all of this information that isn't relevant to get to the information that is. It's far better to just put that stuff in line with their dialogue so they can see it at a glance exactly when they need it in their performance. So get all of this in there, get it clear. Always double space. Use consistent tabs, underlines and capitalizations, and imagine that if you were coming at this cold, could you tell at a glance what bits are for you and what bits are for other people in the team? If you've got a script that does all of those things, you're doing good. Okay, so now a couple of tips about writing prose. Firstly, there are no hard and fast rules, and anyone who tells you that there are is lying. There are things to bear in mind and best practices that you can and probably should follow to make strong descriptive passages, but here's where we get to the nuts and bolts. All of those things can be applied retrospectively. If you're working on a first draft, just write the thing. Don't get hung up on the details too much. Some writers will go in and create what's called a clean draft, but this usually takes practice. Very few writers in their early career will be able to do this or should attempt to. There should always be the assumption, especially early on, that you do need to go through and seriously look at what you've done. But if you do try to create a clean draft up front, it's a recipe for madness, procrastination, loss of passion, and writing paralysis. Basically, every single chapter becomes really hard work, and the idea of then bringing in another idea later on, it makes it seem daunting, because then you'd have to go back and write the stuff that you've already made perfect again to include and support that new thing. Don't do it. Just keep things loose at first. Stay sane. Chill out, have fun, get the words down, and worry about the fine-tuning later. If you're stuck or getting to a part of the book that you've been dreading, just bullet point it. Don't get stuck in a quagmire of effort, hacking your way through a really tough part of the story if it's going to kill your momentum. You can go back and write it later. For now, just keep going. If you have an emotional reaction to what's going on, if you know that it's going to be a passage of thick sort of action and a big action scene or something, and you know that it's going to take a lot of thinking about. And for the readers, it could be really quick to read. It could be really exciting to read. But for you as a writer, it could be really hard to write. So just bullet point it for now. Get back to it later. Just don't lose the momentum in your first draft. If you're really stuck on getting started with your writing, or getting some words down, start with a conversation. If there's an event coming up, get your characters to discuss it. Nothing gets writerly momentum up like dialogue, especially if it's fast-paced and entertaining. It's often where the fun lies. So you can ditch this conversation later, or you might choose to actually include it. It can surprise you like that. But yeah, try having a conversation between your characters. It's a lot of fun. If you are writing a relationship between two characters, and this might be just a personal bugbear of mine, but for crying out loud, have them argue at some point. There is nothing more dull and unrealistic than reading people in a long-term relationship, or any relationship, come to that, where no conflict arises. If you've got two strong people with vested interests in a situation, they are bound to disagree on something somewhere along the line. So please account for this. Have them have an argument. It's really satisfying as a reader to see that kind of, just disagreement happening and unfolding. Yeah, it helps you to identify with the characters. And writing arguments is really fun. And it can feel so cathartic as a writer as well. And if you're looking to, change the direction of your story or really have moments of character development, an argument is where that can happen. You can have an argument take place that really clears the air between your characters and makes the next bit of your story and their behaviour and how they face it make a lot of sense. Because if they've had an argument that has really pointed out some of their flaws as an individual or some of their, the way they sort of approach a problem, they could potentially change that. They could pivot. And it would make sense if they'd just had a blazing row with their partner about how they do this and how it's really frustrating. So, you can really channel that passion and that energy and then pivot a character's, sort of approach to conflict. It's a really useful tool. Finally, my mum's cousin was married to a well-known writer called Herbie Brennan, who sadly passed away quite recently. But I met him at a family gathering a while back. He was a really, really lovely man. And I told him I'm a writer, and he said, "Have you written anything? Have you finished anything?" And I said, "I always lose faith at some point and never get to the end." He took me by the shoulders, looked into my eyes, and said, "Just finish it and don't worry." And I repeat that to myself whenever I feel doubt about what I'm doing. And it's because of those words that I've finished every book, script, and project ever since. As writers, we inevitably hit moments of doubt. We look at what we're doing and we wonder if it's worthwhile. We wonder if what we're actually coming up with is a pile of crap. We don't know, okay? Nobody knows. And I've spoken to famous writers before and I've asked them, how do you get over this? Like, you've had several bestsellers. When does that stop being the case? When do you stop looking at your books and thinking, what am I writing here? And all of them so far have said, it never stops. It never stops. So this statement that he made, just finish it and don't worry, it has made the world of difference. Because at the end of the day, nothing we produce is perfect. It's not. You know, we are artists having fun, telling stories and doing our best. But at the end of the day, nothing's perfect. That's why critics exist. That's why people read books by very famous writers and pull them apart and look at all the things that are wrong and inconsistent and look at all of those aspects that don't make sense. It's because even the people who are, you know, making a lot of money from writing books are not perfect. So just finish it and don't worry.
Thank you for those tips, Emily Inkpen. And thank you for listening to this edition featuring Rachel Knightley, Emily Inkpen and me, Chris Gregory. We hope you've been enjoying the Writers' Gym podcast. If you are, and you've got a friend who's a writer or you belong to a writing group, please tell them about the Writers' Gym and invite them to listen and subscribe to the podcast. You can also help us out by rating and reviewing the podcast wherever you listen. You can leave ratings on Spotify, Apple Podcasts and many other apps, while Apple Podcasts will also allow you to leave reviews. All support is greatly appreciated. Join us next week for the first of the final batch of episodes in this series. We'll be discussing relationships in fiction, making time to write, the art of short fiction and much more. Thank you for listening to the Writers' Gym podcast with Rachel Knightley, Emily Inkpen and me, Chris Gregory. If you'd like to learn more about Rachel and the Writers' Gym, please go to rachel.knightley.com. To find out more about Emily, please go to emilyinkpen.com. And for Chris, go to alternativestories.com. We'll print all these links and more in the show notes for this podcast. The Writers' Gym podcast is an Alternative Stories 2024 production for The Writers' Gym. Production, sound design and editing were by me, Chris Gregory.